I spoke to someone who's a real specialist in information warfare, and he said, oh yeah, of course he's gone. Let me tell you what happens. They show up at your door in the middle of the night. They've got masks on probably. There's a bunch of them. One of them comes to the door. He's very friendly and smiling. And he says, basically, it's the equivalent of you're lying in the dirt. They've got their foot on your throat, and they offer you a hand up. And the hand up is, you take it, or we're going to hurt your child, or you take the hand and you're going to be okay.
I am so excited to have Lara Logan on the show. I'm absolutely titillated. I want to start with a confession. I'm going to make a confession, something I've never shared with anybody before. I had a little bit of a crush on you a long time ago. I was a regular 60 Minutes watcher. We didn't have TiVo or anything like that, so I'd have to tune in on Sunday, and I was hoping that you would have some sort of journalism on that show. And you're like cute. I mean, look how she's very beautiful. You're the cutest thing, and so talented. And I just really loved it when you were on air.
Thank you.
Well, I had a crush on her too, but not in a gay way.
Oh, did you?
It was a role model type of crush.
Oh, I can see that for sure.
I was always mesmerized by you, always.
How did you just take me back? I'm curious because you were like a superstar at a very young age. I mean, how did you even get on? What was your career trajectory to get onto 60 Minutes? This is the highest level of journalism that you could probably attain, I would think. How did that happen?
Yes. Well, it really started in South Africa when I was in high school, and I heard a speech that was given by a journalist. She came to our school, and she spoke to us honestly about extra parliamentary political activity for women. And at the end, I went up to her, to talk to her because I said, I want to be a journalist. And she said, well, why don't you come work at the paper? You can, volunteer. And I did. And it was a classic Newsroom news editor with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, pockmarked, acne face, and every second word was, F this and F that. So, but I had kind of a baptism of fire, and I was given a chance. I mean, it wasn't easy. There were a lot of people who didn't like the fact that there was, a young girl walking through the newsroom, and everyone in the sports department apparently would stop doing their work because I got the complaints. And I had to deal with that. But I worked all through university, all through college. I kept working. I just went to the college and I said, I went to the newspaper, the biggest daily newspaper, and I said, you don't have anyone my age working for you. You need young readers. Let me work for you. And here's all the stories I wrote and got published when I was in high school. And that was pretty much how I did it the whole way through. When I knew I wanted to go into television, and I wanted to be in the foreign media because South Africa was a big story at the time internationally. I got the Foreign Association, Correspondent Association handbook, and I worked my way through it. And I showed up on people's doors and said, hire me. And then, one of the things that I did to kind of prove myself is often in those environments, things just start happening, and I would always just pitch in. So I never waited. I never asked, I never waited to be asked to help. I just thought, like when I went to CNN to go and talk to them about getting a job and the phones started ringing and people were busy, I started answering the phones, and that always ended up getting me hired somehow. The worst job interview, I only ever did one job interview in my whole life. And it was for British television. And they asked me which of the correspondents on their show, on their morning news program, I liked. I'd never watched their news program. I knew who they were, because I'd worked alongside various people over the years, but I only knew one person that had ever reported there. And I said, well, and I named that person. They said, who else? And I was like, I walked out of there. I thought, I am definitely not getting that job, and I do not deserve to get it. And lo and behold, I actually got that job. So how did I get there? Well, very much, I got there by putting myself in the right position. I got there by focusing on the things that mattered And I got there by being bold, I guess, in a way. But I just understood that I needed to be a real journalist, to have something of value to offer. I needed to be and see there and witness things firsthand. I needed to understand. I couldn't take someone else's word for it. I couldn't be, 12 miles back from the front lines in Afghanistan and pretend that I knew what was happening on the front line. I had to be on the front line. And, remarkably few people actually are willing to do that. Some will do it for a moment, for a time, but I went, I wanted to see it through. So I went and lived with Afghan troops in Afghanistan during the first war with the Taliban. And I was staying a few miles back when most of the journalists were. And I realized after a couple nights, this isn't working. I can't wake up in the morning and not know what they bombed in the night. So I went and lived with the Afghan soldiers. And sometimes, people were willing to do that, and sometimes they weren't. But for me, it was never about, like, when I was home, I could have a hot meal. If I really needed to sit on a toilet or sleep in a bed or do it that badly, then I figured I was in the wrong job. So I just didn't worry about that. And there was a correspondent once, Steve Harrigan from Fox News. And, we didn't associate a whole lot with Fox News. When they started, we thought they were crazy because they were politically defined. Who are these people? And I was so shocked that anyone would think that you needed to
The Simpsons.
have a conservative viewpoint, because I was like, what do they mean we're biased? I didn't understand that, because it never even occurred to me that was any bias. And so I was friends with this correspondent, and we were in Afghanistan. He was the only other person there on the front line, him and his cameraman, Joel. And we hadn't bathed, or eaten really in a while. And he said, I spoke to my brother-in-law this morning, and he said, you are so lucky. And he said, I thought about that. And what does he mean I'm so lucky? Like, this is as rough as it gets. And we're being bombed and so on every night. And he said, then it hit me. I really am lucky to be here. And that made me think, yes, there's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be right now. So I stopped thinking about the next meal or, a clean bed or what it would be like to bathe. I stopped thinking about things that really didn't matter very much. I just realized that that I needed not to focus on things that didn't matter and focus on the things that did matter. And, when you're in that situation, just your basic survival is pretty time consuming, because you don't necessarily have power, you don't necessarily have food, you don't necessarily have toilet paper, that kind of thing. How am I going to wash my hair? I am on television. When are we moving to the front? What's happening with the battle? And how do I keep producing content? Well, not content. No, that's a sort of a buzzword for modern day social media. More, it's like, what's my next story? What is important here that I need to be communicating, and how do I capture that? And then, of course, I was on my own, and I was in television, so I had a lot of logistics to deal with on a daily basis. And I learned how to flip the switch, which was, I always tell my children, when my children would say, Mom, I'm hungry, or Mom, I'm cold, and you're somewhere where you can't meet their immediate needs, I say to them, come on, flip the switch. Like, just think how lucky we are to be here right now for
Change
this
your
reason.
state.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It always works for me, because I have a very singular mindset. Like, I know why I'm here, I know what I'm meant to do, and I just focus on that. And fortunately, I found good people along the way who also cared about that, who cared about the journalism more than the stardom, or I mean, just finding like-minded people with real principles who were focused on the task at hand, and then making it happen. And I never thought about, honestly, I never thought about what I looked like. I mean, obviously I would do, try to stay clean and do my makeup in the morning, but then I'd go out and do my job, and I focused on, I think, the things that really mattered. And I took opportunities where I could find them. I created opportunities where I could, on a Saturday night when I was at the newspaper and I was 17, a lot of violence in South Africa at the time. And I volunteered for all the jobs none of the other journalists wanted to do, because they had families, they had lives. This was a career for them. For me, it was, it was the beginning of something of my whole life and everything that I cared about. And so when they said, I said, I'll stay on a Saturday night and get the first edition of the paper and go and deliver it to, we would deliver it to the fire station, the morgue, the hospital, and the police. And that's because there was no, this is 1988, right? There's no internet at that time. So how did you make contacts? How did you learn? How did you find out what was going on? You couldn't Google anything. So you went down and you talked to the guy overnight in the police station, and you made friends, and hopefully he would tell you how many people, how many bodies they picked up and how they were killed and whatever. And then you go to the morgue and talk to the guy at the morgue and get him to do the same thing. And then when he got friendly with me, he'd let me see the bodies, and then you could talk about, well, how did this person die? And then when they came out the next day and said this many people died, you were like, no, that's not true. And you knew, because I saw the bodies with my own eyes. And so I learned the value of firsthand reporting, and I learned the value of relationships. And I guess, I learned a lot from the way that I came up through the industry, and I just put the craft before anything else, and it worked.
So when did you get on 60 Minutes? Was that like your big break? Like, what year was that?
Well, I spent a couple of years trying to get a job at CNN because I thought that was the perfect mix of hard news, but also television, because I'd been working for a news agency for many years. And the frustrating thing with news agencies is you don't control your end product. So you control the inputs, but people can take your product and do whatever they want with it. And I wanted, to create the final product as well. So CNN seemed like a great place to do that because I had hard news skills from working at an agency. But I ended up having a fight with my boss, and he was really rude to me. So I slammed the newsroom door as hard as I could, hoping the window would shatter, and it didn't, fortunately. And I left. I turned my back on a place that was really an incredible home for many, many years in South Africa, and great people. And I got on a plane to London. I flew from South Africa to London, and I knocked on doors, and I got a couple freelance jobs at the networks. And I ended up working at ABC News for a few years on the news desk, which was torture. I got to say, I used about 1/100th of my abilities. At that point, I'd been running quite a big news agency, news gathering operation for television for the whole of Southern Africa and going into East and West Africa. And so it was to come and work on a newsroom, news desk overnight in London was really quite a test of endurance. But I learned from there too, and I just took opportunities that came my way. When the second Intifada happened in the Palestinian territories and Israel, I found out from a friend that a British TV station was looking for a local journalist to hire. So I'm in London, but I called them and said, "Oh, I'm just visiting friends in London. Yes, I live in Jerusalem, and yes, I'd be happy to be your correspondent." And I slept on my friend's couch. So, there were a lot of things like that along the way, but I ended up working at CBS News, and I was actually I was working for British television, but CBS Radio asked me to do some reporting for them because I was the only person that was living on, there was one other journalist, Steve Harrigan from Fox, but I was living on the front line in Afghanistan during the US bombing campaign on my own, and they didn't have anyone. So I started reporting for CBS Radio, which ended up being reporting for CBS Television. And then I went and met the boss of 60 Minutes. Because once, my war coverage really stood out because, honestly, just because I was right there. And I think that I had a lot more information that was of value than people who were miles away. And a lot of people, were surprised to see a girl like me showing up in a place like that. So what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this? My job. So I ended up meeting with the executive producer of 60 Minutes, and I was on the verge of signing a contract with NBC. And, they promised me all kinds of things. I even got tickets to Paul McCartney at Madison Square Gardens to try and sweeten the deal. But it was no question when I got offered a job at 60 Minutes 2 at the time that was where I wanted to be. And I didn't look back. It was 16 years later, I was chief foreign correspondent and full-time correspondent at 60 Minutes and all of that until I got canceled.
Yeah, let's talk about Benghazi. Is that the incident we're going to talk about?
That was it.
Okay.
That was it.
So educate our audience a little bit. What's Benghazi all about? This Libya, some crazy stuff that happened, and you were accused of some faulty reporting, I believe. That's what happened?
Yeah.
So tell us what happened. Share with us.
Well, I think I think what happened to me is that I was living in Iraq for 5 years. I spent most of my time away from the center of power, if you like, in the United States. And I kind of stuck to stories. I didn't really report on American politics because I didn't feel qualified. I wasn't American. I hadn't grown up in America. And I just really thought that that was better served by people who knew more than I did. So I focused on the stories that um, were more challenging for most people, right? Most people don't want to live with Afghan soldiers for months at a time. And so but I did, and I was good at it. And I grew up in Africa and I knew how to survive in those kind of environments. It really didn't bother me very much. And so it wasn't until I was pulled out of Iraq after living there for 5 years, and CBS brought me to the United States. And then I kind of got a baptism of fire in the power, in the corridors of power in America and in American media. So I had been, very happily and somewhat naively trucking along, doing my own thing, doing the stories that I believed in, and being receiving awards and recognition for them, and rising through the ranks at CBS, even though there were a lot of people who made that very difficult. And there were some great people, who made it happen. But then once I was in the United States, now I'm living in Washington, D.C. And now I'm really at a level where people are paying attention. Like, I'll give you an example. I am 6 months pregnant. My phone rings in the DC office. I pick up the phone. It's my landline, and there's a voice on the other end that says, "Hey, Lara, how you doing?" And I don't even know who this person is. Turns out to be David Axelrod, who was working with Obama. And he's like, this is when Obama was running for office. Boss is going to Afghanistan, and how would you like an exclusive? I should have known then, when I heard those words come out of his mouth, that it was a bad sign, because nobody offers you anything in this business, in my experience, right? I had to fight for every story I did. And when you do get offered something, it's probably for the wrong reasons. But I naively thought, oh, wow, okay, yes. I mean, who would say no to that? And off I went to Afghanistan, 6 months pregnant, and I did a good interview with Obama, and it went everywhere and all that. But what I realized years later was I was selected because he didn't have any foreign policy credentials in that campaign. He hadn't been abroad, and that was a weakness for him. And so they used me to give him the credentials that he didn't have. And I didn't understand how the media worked at that time. I was very, I was very genuine, and I worked really hard, and we all did, I thought. And then what happened is I realized, because I started, was winning more and more awards, and I had a much bigger platform. I became full time at 60 Minutes, and I was taking on a bigger role and a bigger voice. And there was a little problem, and it's called real journalism, because I did things like for 2.5 years, I followed the battlefield reports from Afghanistan. And I realized that when Obama was going out and he was saying that Al Qaeda was on the run and Al Qaeda was defeated, and he and the head of the CIA was saying that there were only a couple hundred, less than 200 or something like that, Al Qaeda left in the world. And I was like, what are they talking about? Because I was still reading the battlefield reports every day, coming out of that place where I had lived for a year and spent, many, many, many more months, many more trips reporting. And I was like, this is not true. Why would they be doing this? Like, I mean, I really thought the Bushes, the Cheneys, all those people were bad. And when the Obama came in, I thought, okay, here's the second coming of Christ, right? We've got someone who's actually going to tell the truth about what's happening on the battlefield, who's going to do the right thing for the right reasons. And what I learned was that that wasn't true at all, in any way, shape, or form. And so there was not only the deceit, there was a sense of betrayal, but that didn't motivate me. I mean, I was interested in the truth. And if there was a threat from Islamic terrorism, I didn't want to be lied to about it. And so when I added up the number of Al Qaeda that were killed and injured on the battlefield on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, it dwarfed the number that they said existed in the world. So I did what I always did. I got people on the ground. We got people inside a suicide bomber training camp. We got them training kids how to kill, American soldiers, and we showed that they were lying. And I think that's the story that really got the target on my back. So it didn't help that I was
Before
doing
Benghazi.
So
There's another red flag with Benghazi.
this was real journalism. So you did real journalism.
Yes. And you know what the response was to that story when it came out? They banned all battlefield reporting.
Wow.
Wow.
So they just
Censorship.
stopped doing those reports because it exposed them. So when I did the Benghazi story, I should have known that there was something not quite right because you had such a big issue happen with Benghazi. You had a United States ambassador, Chris Stevens, was the first American ambassador who was killed in more than half a century. And Benghazi flared when it happened, and then it kind of died. And it didn't make a whole lot of sense that there wouldn't be a team at 60 Minutes that wasn't really pursuing that story because it's a natural kind of story. I mean, not only did Chris Stevens die, but you lost Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods. So you had two special operators who were killed working for the CIA as part of GRS, which was their protective security service that the CIA uses abroad. You had Islamic terrorist elements, and you had a big scandal. So that's got all the elements for what the question is: what really happened in Benghazi? It didn't make sense that the Obama administration didn't send in anyone to save these guys. And then I was at strangely enough, my daughter's christening. And we had a party at our house after the christening at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And I got a friend come up to me and say he'd just come back from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and he had a message for me from someone of significance, who I can't say who. And this person said, you want to look at the two guys that we had on the ground in Benghazi, because if it weren't for them, we would have had the worst hostage crisis in American history, and certainly since the Iranian hostage crisis. Now that got my attention. As you know, there was no mention of Obama or Hillary or Democrat or Republican. This was a story that was, that a tip that came to me that said, we were in real trouble. What really happened is not known. And when you find out the details, you won't believe it. So I started to investigate. And what I learned was that we had two operators for Delta Force on the ground in Libya, whose job was to collect all of these weapons, many of which had been supplied to the Libyans by the United States, and they wanted these weapons gone. Now, this is not uncommon. We have units, and we have entities within the United States government, especially under the Defense Intelligence Agency and Department of Defense, whose job it is to track weapons that are made in the U.S. or sold by the U.S. and so on. And what was the issue here was that these two gentlemen, when they heard Chris Stevens under attack, they went all around the embassy in Tripoli, the capital of Libya, and they collected money from the people, the staff. And they hired a small plane, and they flew down to Benghazi. And they were the ones who contacted a local militia, because when you have special operators, they rely heavily on local alliances because they don't come with force and with numbers. They come with speciality, right? Special skills. And they got this local militia, and they were the ones that got that militia to go and retrieve Chris Stevens's body from the hospital. And they were the ones that fought their way to the CIA annex and rescued the remaining Americans who were still alive and brought back the bodies of Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods. And not once were they ordered by anyone in their chain of command. Not once did an order come from Washington, D.C. These guys went on their own steam. And if it were not for them, the hundreds and hundreds of al-Qaeda operatives and Islamic terrorists that had surrounded the annex could possibly have overwhelmed the annex. Now that is a phenomenal story by anybody's standards, because nobody even knew that these two guys were involved in Benghazi. Wow. And how was I able to verify the details? Well, because they were both up for medals. Now, one of them, his branch of service when he went into the Army, was already Navy. So he got the Navy Cross, and the other one got the Silver Star. If these two guys, if this had not been a political event, they would have been up for the Medal of Honor. Wow. But you can't give them the Medal of Honor when you've got Hillary Clinton has already said, what difference would it make, right? There's been a furore over what really happened in Benghazi, and nobody knows the truth. So this was a fascinating story for me. This was something really important. And about 6 months into that investigation, I got contacted by a woman at CBS who deals with books, because we had an office. Neil Armstrong writes a book. Who does he want? 60 Minutes. You want to sell your book? You go to 60 Minutes. I never got any of those stories because I was low down in the pecking order. I had people, giants like Ed Bradley and Mike Wallace and Morley Safer ahead of me. And you think these people, you think I had any say? I was going to get a layup like that? Here's a great story. Go do it. No, I had to go and live in and walk through sewage canals and live in the trenches and come up with my own reporting. So I didn't mind that. I actually liked that. But when we, one after another, these Benghazi books started popping up and they were being thrown at me. And a couple of them were just nonsense. I later found out that, one was actually just a made up narrative by Clinton allies that was meant to be disinformation and lead us astray. But I didn't fall for any of that. But the one book that we got was from a guy, a British security contractor who had been hired by the State Department. He'd been vetted by the State Department, and he was responsible for the perimeter, the outer security at Benghazi. And so we started talking to him and his co-author of the book. And this we didn't. This turned out later to be a Simon and Schuster book, but that had nothing to do with it at the time. And he was the only person in our story who had been on the ground and actually witnessed as an eyewitness. And of course, with reporting, a first-hand source is always better than a second-hand source. Mm-hmm. And so that's what drew us to his story. And we vetted him extensively. We got copies of his military records from his unit in the UK. We got copies of the stamps in his passport that showed that he was in Libya when he said he was in Libya, that he actually went to Benghazi. We got photographs of him on the ground. We verified him with the State Department. We did absolutely everything that we could. But the one thing that we agreed to do was sign an NDA, which was written by CBS's attorneys. It was a standard NDA. CBS had 2 NDAs that they would use frequently. And in that NDA, we agreed that we would not reveal the contents of the book and his story about what happened that night of the attack to anyone outside of our bosses at 60 Minutes for the purpose of deciding whether or not we would do the story with him. So this was something that we took very seriously. And it was really quite amazing because in the end, when they came after us for our poor reporting, this is what they attacked, is that we hadn't vetted his story. I looked at my boss and I was like,
did he deceive you at the end of the day? Did he deceive you?
Well, they came out. The thing is that this guy told us that when the attack happened, he was at his apartment because he lived in the city of Benghazi. He didn't live at the Special Mission compound, and that he had gone there to check on his friends, and that he hadn't been able to get near because the fires were raging and so on, and all the roads were blocked, and he described everything that he saw. And then he went to the hospital, and he says he saw Chris Stevens' body. There's a whole lot more detail, but I won't go into it because it's already a long story. But then he says he goes back to his apartment, and some more of his guys, because he trained all these local security guys, and he's very close to them. And he gets a phone call, by the way, from one of the State Department regional security officers who says to him, this is what we talked about. Our worst nightmare has come to fruition, and exactly what we feared is happening, and we're all going to die. And he tells us about this bond that he has with this guy and how, they agreed they would always come to each other's rescue if they ever needed it. And so he's just wrestling with himself. And when his guys show up, he goes back for a second time. And this is when he says he scaled over the wall using some construction, and he looks around. He can't find anyone, can't find any Americans. Someone spots him. He hides in a dog kennel. And then this guy, calls him closer. He's getting by with his limited Arabic, and it's dark and all the chaos. But then a guy starts to pay attention to him and calls him over. And he punches this guy in the face, runs, and escapes. That's it. And then the next day, so he goes back to his place, and he doesn't tell his boss that he went back there. He lies to his boss and says, I stayed at the compound all night. But in the morning on the way to the airport, he goes by the compound again. He takes all of the photographs that actually provided the basis for the FBI. Remember, the FBI took weeks to go in. And he took all these photographs, which were used as evidence in the Benghazi investigation and in the prosecution, and certainly throughout the investigations. And what they did to us was they said that this guy was lying, not about going the first time, not about going on his way to the airport and taking all the photographs, not about being there and seeing what he's seeing. They said that he lied about scaling the wall and essentially doing nothing, that he made up that tale. He says, I didn't lie. He tells us they produce, what they did is they ran a smear campaign that was extremely efficient. It was extremely well funded. It was run by elements within the Obama administration, but also elements without, like Media Matters for America. And they went one by one to every reporter in DC that they could reach, and to every news outlet, and to everyone. And they were shopping around this document that they claimed was an after-action report, supposedly written by the security company, by this guy and the security company he worked for, that said he didn't go, he went there the first time, then he spent the night at his place, and he went back again the next day, and he never went on that second visit. And he looked at this and he said to us, this matches what I told my boss, but I never wrote this, and I've never seen this report. Now, if that report was real, it would be classified, but nobody cared about that. And this guy was holding his ground, saying, I've never seen it. It's not, and we went to the deputy. Chris Stevens had a deputy ambassador, Greg Hicks. We took this document to Greg Hicks. He said, I've never seen that document in my life. And by the way, it has a stamp on it that says U.S. Embassy Benghazi, and we don't have a U.S. Embassy in Benghazi. We have a special mission compound, which is a whole nother legal entity, and in diplomatic terms, it's a big deal. And so he said to us, this document, I can't tell you it's for sure it's fake, but if it was real, there's no reason I wouldn't have seen it, because I took over 10 minutes into the attack. Chris Stevens called Greg Hicks. Wow. Greg Hicks was the last person to speak to Chris Stevens when he was alive. And I believe the real reason they went after our reporting was because of what Greg Hicks said. When I asked him about whether they called for help, and he said, of course. And he said that the defense attaché, who, for those of you who don't know, the defense attaché is usually your top spy in any embassy, right? He said, I looked at the defense attaché and I said to him, well, and he looked at me, and this is what Greg Hicks said under oath when he testified before Congress, and it's what he told us in our 60 Minutes piece. He said, I looked at this man and I asked him, well, and he said, he looked at me and he said, I'm sorry, Greg, but the cavalry ain't coming. And he said, and that decision never changed. So think about this. 10 minutes into the attack, he asks, are we getting any help? The defense attaché says no. And he says, that decision never changed. And he said, I felt sick in the pit of my stomach, because those of us who go out on the end of the line for our country, we believe our country has our back. And in that moment, I knew they didn't. And I looked at him and I said, we got to tell the boys at the annex. Now, 2 of those boys at the annex died that night. So you imagine, we've gone through all of these hearings, and we've gone through all of this hand wringing, and everybody's arguing about, was it 1 attack, was it 2 attacks, did they know the second one was coming, could they have done something, could they have gotten there fast enough, and so on and so on. And 10 minutes into the attack, that decision had already been made. So the rest of it was all theater. Wow. And if you look at what has happened since Benghazi, we left Americans behind in Benghazi. If it weren't for those 2 operators who I reported on, I broke the news about them in my Benghazi report, right? No one would have ever known about that. That was the first time that news was ever heard by the American people. And we're talking about, it had been more than a year since Benghazi had happened. So they didn't want that out.
And
they didn't want Greg Hicks to talk.
The sad thing about this, though, is what we didn't know until, Trump came out with fake news. We thought we were always being told the truth.
Correct.
Meanwhile, what you experience has been happening for a really, really long time. I mean, my mom was born in Iran, and she used to tell me things when I was young, like, you just don't know. Like, something else is going on. You will never know because the media will never tell you, because the CIA is in on it, because blah, blah, blah. And I'd look at my mom and I'd go, come on, Mom, really? You know, like, I didn't believe it until very recently. 2016 is when they started to slowly open my eyes. And it wasn't until 2020 until I was wide awake. So you're in it. You're on the ground thinking that your job is to do real reporting, real journalism. Meanwhile, the Obamas know what they did. They weren't going to help anyone.
They knew.
And you were reporting the truth.
And Hillary, by the way, because Hillary was running for office. And that was my big mistake, is that I underestimated what that meant. I had never done a story for a political reason. It never occurred to me to do a story for a political reason, to hurt a candidate or to help a candidate in an election. I mean, what are you talking about? But that story was so damaging to Hillary Clinton, because the truth was that they did leave Americans behind. They let Chris Stevens die. They let Tyrone Woods die. They let Glenn Doherty die. And if it weren't for those two operators who did everything on their own, all of those Americans could potentially have died. And they didn't want anybody finding that out.
Well, let's talk about your cancellation. So you were basically roadkill, in effect. Somebody had another initiative, and so it's whatever happens to Lara happens. And basically, you became the fall guy for all of this. They had to retract your reporting. Somebody at CBS was talking to somebody politically, and they decided, you know what, we have to pull the story back. It's not in their political best interest, and Lara's career is going to be doomed. Is that sort of like what happened?
Sort of. I mean, there's a couple things. One is that Ben Rhodes was one of the chief architects of the fake story that what happened in Benghazi was because of a film. Do you remember that? It was the whole, because there were protests in Egypt and other places. They tried to say that all of this was about a film that had been made that had upset the Islamic world. And that was nonsense, right? This was a terrorist attack. And Chris Stevens told Greg Hicks that when he called him from inside his compound not that long before he died. So, but Ben Rhodes' brother, David Rhodes, was the president of CBS News at the time. So I have always wanted to see the communications between CBS and the White House, and between David Rhodes and Ben Rhodes, right? Because he was later revealed to be the person that was really running the information operation to cover up what they had done in Benghazi. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is when I said to people, look, we knew that this guy told his boss that he lied to his boss, because he couldn't tell him that he went out again. His boss said to him, stay put. I don't want anything to happen to you. And his story is that he can't betray these people. He can't leave them. He's got to try to do something. He tries to do something and he does nothing, and he fails. So that was his, if he made up, the only part of his story that was ever called into question was that. Nothing else he said was called into question except by one or two random people who tried to say that he wasn't really in the military, or, they made up a few other things, but those died on the vine. Our problem was that when we said, well, we knew he lied to his boss, they said, well, then you put a known liar on television, and so they had figured it out. They found a mechanism by which to discredit us no matter what. And I actually found out from another reporter that they had 2 lines of operation ready to go. So whichever version of his story we went with, they had the attack prepared. And then they have their people that they have placed throughout the media. And they use those people because they know that those people are going to do and say whatever they want. So we had this woman, Nancy Youssef from McClatchy. We ended our story with a page of Chris Stevens' schedule.
McClatchy owns the Herald,
that day in Benghazi.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, they folded McClatchy. They've gone to the trash bin of history where they belong. But what Nancy Youssef did was she said that even the image of Evans' schedule, which was still lying in the ruins of that building where he died, was faked because the building had been renovated, which was complete nonsense. There were 3 buildings and only one of them had been renovated, and that building was very much still in ruins. So they just got to make up stuff. They got to make up whatever they wanted. Because when you've got everybody attacking you like that, you've now lost your ability to defend yourself. It's an onslaught. It's coming at you from every angle. I have to put the interests of the show and the interest of the team and the interest of the network first, because my instinct is to fight, right? I want to fight every part of it, but it's not about me anymore. There are other people that are impacted. And what happens? It's the classic moment. This guy is out there saying, "This, I told the FBI everything." And that is not, that report that they've printed, I didn't write it. I don't know where it came from. It's nothing to do with me, and it's not true. But what happens? He then gets a death threat. He lives in Wales in these mountains. He gets a death threat, and he says he reports it to the police, and he disappears. So he's gone. So maybe he got a death threat, maybe he didn't. The police confirmed that he did report it when we called them. But what happens to me is he's not standing by his story anymore. And I spoke to someone who's a real specialist in information warfare, and he said, "Oh, yeah, of course he's gone. Let me tell you what happens. They show up at your door in the middle of the night. They've got masks on, probably. There's a bunch of them. One of them comes to the door. He's very friendly and smiling. And he says, basically, it's the equivalent of you're lying in the dirt. They've got their foot on your throat, and they offer you a hand up. And the hand up is you take it, or we're going to hurt your child, or you take the hand and you're going to be okay." Because look what happened. That guy never suffered. He never struggled to get more contracting work. So you would think a guy that's really controversial, that speaks out, that has this massive media storm around him, you would think he might struggle to get secure government contracts again. But he never did. And I don't think I don't know. The truth is, I don't know. But years later, when The Atlantic came and did another hit piece on me, more than a decade later, when the reporter was thinking that she was still going to try to get me to talk, and she was trying to curry favor with me, she sent me photographs of a text exchange she had with him. And he said to her in this text exchange, every word I told Lara Logan more than a decade ago was 100% accurate. It's true. I still stand by my story today. She was attacked. It was completely unfair. It was completely dishonest. And he said, I will never, ever do another interview on this again, because you people aren't interested in the truth.
Wow. So what happened to you? Like when did things start to unravel? Did you lose your job right away? How bad did it get? Take us through that. We want to hear more about you and what happened with you.
Well, I'm in an edit suite at 60 Minutes.
Okay.
We're just doing one incredible story after another at that point.
What year was this?
What? Yeah, what year are we talking about?
2013, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I had done an amazing story on Super 6-1, the first helicopter that crashed in Mogadishu, that it was about to be buried, and this American couple that pulled that out piece by piece, and we were just doing amazing work. And we were in the edit suite working on a story, and the phone rang, and my boss said, "I need to talk to you." Now, this had been rumbling, right? They'd been digging at the story. They were like, "Oh, 60 Minutes didn't disclose that this book that this guy wrote was published by a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster." And we hadn't done it because my boss at the time had said, "Who cares?" He's like, "That had nothing to do with, there's nothing to do with the story. We didn't even, we didn't pay any attention to that. It's like, are we going to do this for every little thing?" So then when they attacked us on that, he said, "Okay, I was wrong. We should have said it. Okay, we apologized for that." Then they had John Kerry, who was Secretary of State. They had his press person go to Scott Pelley at 60 Minutes and say, "Oh, there's a problem with the Benghazi story," And then everything was hinging on this guy, because he had said, "I stand by my story. I told the FBI everything that happened." And we had all the emails that showed that the FBI had gone to his house, that the CIA had gone to the same meeting and met with him, that the State Department had people there. We also had emails that showed that there was an FBI agent who had flown out after that meeting and brought photographs of people, suspects in the attack, and had gone to meet with him and asked him to see if he could identify any of them. So we knew that the FBI treated this man as credible. We knew that he had a security clearance. He had to have a security clearance to work for the State Department. We knew that they'd vetted him and cleared him. And now, what did we have? We had a situation where I turned to my boss and I said, I'm a little bit worried that the FBI is going to come out and say, that's not what he told us, and they could be lying. And my boss, this is the time we were in. My boss looked at me incredulous and he said, "Are you nuts? You're saying the FBI would lie about something like this?" And I'm like, "Maybe." And he's like, "That's ridiculous. Get out of my office," kind of thing, right? Couldn't even entertain it because the idea that you could lie on that kind of scale about something of that significance was just beyond our comprehension at that point. Well, look where we are today. Nobody would have any trouble believing that the FBI could lie about something like that. But that's exactly what happened. We got a 60-minute, a CBS person. My boss got him, "Call your buddies at the FBI." His buddies at the FBI said, "Oh, yeah, moment I saw that guy, I knew he was lying." Really? Except that you had agents flying out to meet with him and get him to identify suspects for you and help you with your case. But you knew he was a liar. Anyway, they wouldn't let us, deal with any of that. I just got called down to my boss's office and he said that the New York Times, we have a problem. New York Times has seen the reporting and they say it's not true. Well, that turned out not to be true at all. What it turned out was that the New York Times was briefed by two members of the State Department who claimed to have been briefed by two members of the FBI who said that they had seen the 302 report that had been done by the FBI. So I never got to see any of that. But that was it for CBS.
So then what happened to you?
They surrendered. So I took my punishment like a big girl. I did what you're supposed to do. I did the right thing. I said, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" I
Okay.
volunteered to apologize.
On
And they
air.
said, "Okay, we're gonna have to pull the story. You're gonna have to apologize on 60 Minutes. No problem. You're gonna have to go on CBS News and apologize. No problem. Happy to do that." And I did all of the above. And I stayed in the office that night until very, very, very late because we were trying to figure out how to explain this, how to say this in a way that was accurate.
But
and that
why
was
did you
honest.
apologize? Because you didn't do anything wrong.
Well, yeah. Did you struggle with this
because-
decision?
No, I didn't. I knew that I was putting a rope around my neck and hanging myself publicly. And it was if I could have chosen, I would have wanted to know. I wanted to know the truth. And I knew we didn't know the truth. The problem that I had was I didn't have any way to get to the truth. And I had to I was out of time. I was out of options. When CBS collapsed and 60 Minutes surrendered, my options were over. So as the leader of the team, as the face of the story, the only right thing for me to do was take responsibility.
But they collapsed and surrendered politically. It was all political motivation. There was somebody at the top that was orchestrating it to basically
Yes.
make sure that Hillary didn't get hurt. It's kind of like the,
And maybe
the
not
Hunter
just at the
Biden.
top, maybe alongside you, maybe all around you. And this is the problem I had though. I didn't know the truth anymore because this guy was gone. And we couldn't get so he said that when he went there that second time he had two Libyans with him. I wanted to get to those guys, but 60 Minutes didn't allow me to go to Libya during the reporting of the story. So we had to use someone else to go, and they did a very good job for us on the ground, documenting everything with GPS coordinates and everything else, but I wasn't able to talk to those two Libyans. And it was so dangerous in Benghazi. Benghazi was controlled by Al-Qaeda at that time. Remember, it wasn't very long after Benghazi happened that the U.S. embassy was overrun in Tripoli and the U.S. fled. We didn't even have an embassy. So this is a time where, people were terrified, and rightly so, because the terrorists were running Libya. And
So when you apologized, you still were standing in your truth, would you say? Because you were not able to double confirm?
Well, but her bosses, everybody collapsed around her, so they weren't even giving her an opportunity to do what she needed to do, right?
And the words were carefully chosen. We made a mistake. So that, for me, how did I reconcile that with my own integrity?
Yeah.
Well, I did make a mistake.
That's where I'm at. That's what I'm asking, basically.
There were mistakes I made. Now, I didn't believe the mistakes that I made were the ones that were being, I was laughed at when I said, well, we had an NDA. We vetted everything we could with the State Department. We literally took, when he said on the North Wall pointing at this degree on this side next to this part of the embassy. The security camera went out in April, and then it took me 3.5 months to get it fixed. Like, we match details like that with the State Department's own reporting. Okay, we did things that were above and beyond what 99% of reporters do every single day. There's not a chance in hell that they come close. And we were accused of sloppy journalism. But the only thing that we, because we didn't take his story that night and violate the NDA and get people to comment on it. And remember, this was all happening in an environment where I literally had people that I had known for years at Special Operations Command, at SOCOM in Tampa, that wouldn't even talk to me from work. And literally were going to the neighbor's house to call me from someone else's phone on the weekend to say, never put the word Benghazi in an email to me again. Because if it is known that I am communicating with any reporter about this, I will lose my job. I mean, they did not want the truth to get out. And it's very easy, of course, in hindsight, all those reporters who are quarterbacking everything. So when this guy said in the NDA, hey, listen, I need my story to be protected because if they find out, they're going to come after me, and I could be killed. Okay, so we signed the NDA. But everyone, at 60 Minutes, they were like, well, the NDA doesn't mean anything. And my producer and I are like, what? It's a legal document. We honored it, but apparently honor was not important to most people there because they were like, oh, you don't have to honor that. What?
So this public apology was made, and then what happened to your career? I mean, what happened from there?
Well, I do want to say that making that apology was obviously one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. And I didn't get any sleep, and I had a tiny little room at this hotel that was like a broom closet because we booked the room late. I wasn't supposed to be there that night, and it was like 130 degrees in there because it was next to the furnace for this hotel, and so I had a pounding headache. It was one of the worst days of my life, and I had to go out there and do that and be grilled, by the way, by people who I knew never do a modicum of the reporting that we did, and I had to eat crow publicly. So nationwide. So it was a nationwide humiliation without a doubt. And I had to record the 60 Minutes studio where I made a statement that we had withdrawn the story because someone had lied to us. And now it was possible that he had lied to us. I didn't know for sure that that wasn't true. So I was careful about the language that I agreed to. But certainly the impression that people had was that I believed he was lying to us. And I didn't believe that, but I couldn't say it. So I had to go home to DC that night. Les Moonves was then CEO of CBS and Viacom. And he called me and told me, Lara, we're a family. You've done so much for this company. We love you. Your work is second to none. And we stand by you. And so, I felt uneasy. Of course, I'd never been in a situation like this, but I had a lot of faith in my bosses at 60 Minutes. When we worked there, we worked really hard and we knew each other really well. I'd been gang raped and sodomized and beaten almost to death in Egypt. I had been blown up in Afghanistan multiple times. I'd been in ambushes with people shot in front of me. I had lived, I was 8.5 months pregnant, walking on operations in sewage canals, sewage up to here in Helmand province in southern Afghanistan. I had been rocketed and shot at, and I'd been through extreme situations. And my 60 Minutes and CBS, my team were like, I spent more time with them than my family, right? And we pulled off the extraordinary. I flew to Afghanistan and pulled off an exclusive interview with the president and put that together within like days, back and forth and headline. So when you work like that, you have bonds it's kind of like a band of brothers is how it feels. And so, I didn't want to lose that. I was afraid to lose my job. I had the only job I ever really wanted. It was perfect for me because you had time to learn the truth before you went out there and you had time to do something meaningful. So I never wanted another job. I never wanted to anchor a show. And I had to go home in disgrace and take abuse and read one report after another that was a complete lie. So just think about this. All of these journalists attacking me for shoddy journalism are all writing things about the story that are completely 100% false.
The irony.
Did you imagine the irony of that? And then get this, the New York Times does a piece, a glowing piece, elevating David Brock from Media Matters for America and his great success in taking down Lara Logan, which he says is our greatest success to date. So an organization that claims to be about honesty and in the media and guarding against bias in the media, he details how he ran an operation where his staff came in the early hours of the morning and they worked all day, and he had teams of people dedicated to taking me out.
Wow.
And he was ecstatic. But what happened to me that Friday afternoon, after I did all the apologies, I did the news in the morning and I did the studio in the afternoon, and then I'm going to go back to DC. Well, when I come up, I have to be up on Monday morning, dreading it. So I go up on Monday morning, and my boss calls me into his office, and he says to me, "I'm really sorry, but I have to do something because they're baying for blood, basically. And if I don't do something, they're never going to stop." That's the political pressure. They had no reason to fire me because I hadn't done anything wrong. They had no grounds to fire me. So what they did is he said, "I have to put you on leave." And he said, and I looked at him, it was very hard to speak in that moment, but I said, "Can it just be me?" Because I didn't want it to be my producer, who's an extraordinary, amazing man, incredible producer, and I didn't want him to have to go through that. And my boss swallowed repeatedly, and he looked out the window because he's got a window. He had a corner office overlooking the Hudson River, and he couldn't speak. And when he looked back, he had tears rolling down his face, and he said, "I knew you would say that." And he said, "I got to tell you, you're the best person on this floor." And at 60 Minutes, that's a big deal because compliments are short, especially I was lost in the pecking line, behind a lot of great people. And I was very much aware of that. And I didn't mind earning my place. And that was one of the worst moments. And so there I went on leave, but I was still paid, thank goodness, because I had a family to take care of and young kids. But what happened over time, so this is what they do, and this is very helpful for your audience, right? So there's the initial shock attack where they come at you from every angle. Then this one's piling on, this one's piling on, that one's piling on. You're now answering allegations that are completely fabricated, that have nothing to do with the real issue. And one of the things that drove them nuts was that I said Al-Qaeda, and I didn't call it Ansar al-Sharia Libya, which is what everyone else said. And that drove them nuts because they were pushing a false narrative that Al-Qaeda was dead and buried. But what Al-Qaeda did was they rebranded. So when you have sanctions against you, you can't operate, right? You're a known terrorist organization. So Al-Qaeda created branches, Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia, Ansar al-Sharia Libya, Turkey, so on and so on. And now they operate. But this was a front for Al-Qaeda. And we knew that from our extensive reporting. So that drove them nuts. So then they did stories saying that, we lied and said it was Al-Qaeda, and Ansar al-Sharia's got nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And we named Sufyan bin Kumu, the man who was actually responsible for the attack. Guess what? The New York Times had been reporting that this other idiot, who was a fake person, that puppet that they put up as the front, that he was responsible. So they did a whole bunch of hit pieces about how we got that wrong. 2 years later, what happens? The Obama Treasury indicts Sufyan bin Kumu for the Benghazi attack and sanctions him for being the ringleader of the Benghazi attack. So we were right about everything, and they couldn't bear it. So what did they do? They do that shock attack. They pile on because now the weight of credibility is with them. So all the things about your reporting that they don't want people to know, they target that. And they throw it out there with no backing whatsoever, and no one cares. I'm like a piece of meat, and I'm at a feeding frenzy, and I got great whites coming, taking a chunk. And the more sharks smell blood in the water, they're coming for more and more and more. And that's what it was like. I had people in front of my house. I had people at the back of, reporters, right? I had everybody coming at me. And now every person that has always hated you because you were successful and they weren't, or you were, better than them, whatever it happened to be, now they've got their chance. And they're going to come, boy. They don't hold back. And they get to hide behind anonymity. And what they do, so now I'm on leave, and my boss at the Christmas party, because this happened around Halloween, he tells everyone I'm going to be back soon. Well, they leaked that. So then what happens? He gets attacked for saying that.
Oh,
so now
boy.
he can't bring me back soon, right?
Yeah.
But then this is the most important part for people to understand. When the initial attack fails, what they do is a long form story. So it'll be the New York Magazine, or it'll be Atlantic Magazine, it'll be somebody like that, or Vanity Fair, and they will do a much more strategic attack. So they will take a look at what they did, what worked, what didn't work, and they will look for vulnerabilities. So this article was, I was then not allowed to come back to work until this article was out, which was weird, which tells you that people within CBS were collaborating with that because they knew that this article was going to prevent me from ever coming back to CBS. And there was actually a woman, a female producer, was a source for that article, who told someone that I know that after this article comes out, her CBS career will be over and she will never work again. Wow. So this is what I'm hearing from all these people, right? When the article comes out, on the surface, it doesn't look so bad. It's called Benghazi and the Bombshell. Yes, it's full of nonsense about me, complete lies, but I'm not the only person in the article. What it did was it did two things. Number one, it dragged in Les Moonves. And anyone who worked at CBS knew that Les Moonves could not bear bad publicity. He would shut down the press office for months at a time around any public events like shareholder events or affiliate conferences or whatever, because he couldn't bear it. And so what did they do? They dragged Les Moonves into the Benghazi affair. They said that I would say things to people like, oh, if you don't let me do this, I'm going to make one call to Les Moonves and end your career. Complete and utter nonsense. I spoke to Les Moonves maybe 5 times in 16 years at CBS. I had nothing really to say to him other than pleasantries. I didn't know the man. I would never have called him about anything. So they just fabricated this stuff, but they did it to make Les Moonves look bad. And why? Because Les Moonves would put pressure on my boss to get rid of the problem.
Yeah,
and then what did they do to my boss? They made him sound like a love-struck puppy. And then my boss spent the rest of the time proving that he wasn't.
And then it's game over for you. So then you got fired?
No, they couldn't fire me. They didn't have ground.
So what? You stayed on leave for a long time?
When they brought me back, they tortured me. They made me go to every show at the news division and do work for them. So I had to meet with like the morning show producers, and I had to do stories for them, which I did, because CBS 60 Minutes was now in the summer break. And so now they said, well, you got to get back out there on these other shows before, the new season starts. So I did all of that. I took my punishment. I made the most of it, and I actually worked with great people, and I did Shimon Peres' interview. I did a lot of big things. As usual, I did what I did. I did my job. And they didn't expect that. And then I came back to 60 Minutes, and when that contract was up, they treated me like I was worthless. They treated, the bottom person at CBS was given more, was treated with more respect and kindness and regard than I was. It was an extremely stressful situation, and my agent kept saying to me, why are you doing this? And I'm like, I'm not going to make it easy for them. I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to get me to quit because they don't have grounds to fire me, and I'm not going to do that. And then when it came up, so I ended up being in hospital 6 times in 8 months. I had a hysterectomy that wouldn't heal. I had massive surgeries, and I was in a really bad way. The doctors were worried that I was going to die. And my first story back at 60 Minutes, I went to Liberia at the height of the Ebola epidemic to do that story. And the day before I left, I had to go to the doctor's office and have a scan to make sure that my sutures were still intact so that I didn't die on that journey. And that was one of the most dangerous stories I have ever done. But I did it anyway, only now I was doing it without the backing and support of the people I worked for. So that made it very hard. And I realized at a certain point, I'm going to die. That's what the doctors told me. You're going to die if you keep doing this. So I said to my agent, tell CBS I want to move back to Texas where my husband is from. and I want to go from full-time, I'll be a part-time correspondent. Give them a deal. And they took that deal. So my next contract was to be part-time. And my boss said to me, hopefully you'll be able to come back. Your kids will be a little bigger. You can be the mom you want to be and all the rest of it. And I was like, yes, absolutely. And of course, when I got to the end of that contract 3 years later, that was when David Rhodes was like, not under any circumstances in hell would he renew my contract. So I was never fired, but I was effectively fired.
How low did it get for you? What was your lowest point? Was it emotional, physical? Like, maybe you could share with us. Financial.
Well, I had significant injuries from being attacked while on assignment for 60 Minutes in Egypt, internal injuries, and I lived with a lot of pain. So there were nights, when it was late at night and there wasn't anyone else around except my team, like sometimes I would crawl to the bathroom because I couldn't walk. And I think the hardest part for me was realizing that when that happened, like just over there right now in my studio, I have a massive box full of thousands upon thousands of letters that were written to me when that attack happened. And what I realized was that none of that meant anything. CBS had said that they would stand by me. They weren't going to stand by me. I was just tossed out like trash. And I think, honestly, the most difficult part was
I'm sorry, by the way, that you had to
letting
experience
go. Thank you. It's okay. I mean, I got to live, and my children were 1 and 2 at the time. No, they were actually, my daughter was 10 months old, and my son was 1. And then when I got cancer the following year, my son was 2 and my daughter was 1. So, and then the following year, Benghazi happened. So it had been, my mother died. Then I was, gang raped and almost killed. Then I got cancer, and then Benghazi hit. So it was, it was pretty intense. But the hardest part was that I was still struggling physically with significant issues, and I was treated really badly. I mean, it was pure torture on a daily basis, and so that I think was the lowest part, was just coming to terms with and accepting that these great people that I worked alongside with, who meant so much to me, that I would never work with them again. And then of course, once you're targeted like that, no one
They
will
all
touch.
they all turned their back on you, though, right? At the end, your boss turned your back on all your coworkers.
Not all. I still stayed in touch with my boss, and obviously it affected the relationship. And then he was forced out not that long afterwards. And I think it probably felt for him like, the Benghazi thing opened the door and made him vulnerable, and that maybe contributed to what they were able to do. Because my boss was an incredible journalist and a great man, and it hurt because he was a ruthless mentor, but an incredible mentor, and I loved him and his wife and his family. I mean, when you work like that and you work 18-hour days, and you go through these things together. I mean, you imagine, it's like I had to, the night that I was gang raped, and I'm sitting there in my hotel room, and I'm somewhat hysterical, almost like a rabid animal at times, and I had to call my husband and tell him what happened to me, what they did to me. And I said to him, look, I called my husband and I said, look, I need you to do 2 things. 1, listen to me. I'm going to tell you what they did to me. And 2, I need you to pick up the phone and call Jeff Fager and tell him. Because I needed my boss to understand. But I couldn't say those words to him. I couldn't speak those words to him. And my husband did that for me. And my boss was amazing. He was, and he flew down and he came to see me, and we went through a lot together. When you're in sewage up to your neck at 4.5 months pregnant, or you're climbing mountains on counter-terrorism operations at 8.5 months pregnant, I mean, how many bosses in the world would let you do that? Body armor around my waist, pack on my back, literally, well, on my butt half the time. I will admit, I did spend a lot of time in those mountains sliding. But, he had real respect for me, and I had real respect for him. They tore all those relationships apart, and 60 Minutes never recovered. They never, ever, ever got back their moral courage.
To this day, really.
To
They're
this
going
day.
through the ringer at this very moment, even.
They basically allowed themselves to be completely controlled for whatever political nonsense, and ever since then, everybody else probably watched that thinking if they can do that to her, they'll do it to us.
That's right.
So then you had a bunch of pansies that now everybody just shuts their mouth and does what they're told. And now nobody trusts 60 Minutes. I mean, I never watch. I used to watch 60 Minutes all the time. I never watch it anymore. In fact, I can't stand it because now I know what they really are. But when you were there, it represented something different. It had a soul. It had at least
Courage. You were on the front, you're literally on the front lines, a war correspondent. You represented courage.
And I remember when you came out with, what had happened to you, and I was crying just watching, because I'm like, as a woman, I'm like, this lady, like, and she has the courage to share it with everybody, and she's still out there fighting and doing everything that it takes. Unfortunately, they don't make journalists like you anymore. I wish they do, and I wish that there were more journalists that would actually speak up and fight for the truth and honesty, because the reason we are being so bamboozled in this world is because everybody is staying silent. Way too many people are staying silent. And we need more of you. We need more of the Megyn Kellys who are not afraid to go outside and say, no, you're not going to silence me, and I am going to tell the truth. Because people deserve to hear the truth, and that's why I'm here.
Well, fortunately, I'm not the only one. I mean, we are in short supply. You're not wrong about that. And that's why, having people like yourselves that's why you have to step into the breach. You shouldn't have to be doing this, right? We shouldn't even be at this point as a society where people can use the media as a weapon of mass destruction. Yeah. That's what they use it for. They use it to come after people and destroy them. I steal a line from a guy I know really well who rescues kids, who told me once that child sex trafficking is how you murder a child without killing them. And I realized, wow, like that is very powerful. And that's exactly what they do to us. When you come after someone and to destroy their reputation, this is how you murder someone without killing them. Because they don't just want you to lose your job. They want you to become unemployable, right? They don't, and there were people, I think Slate, there was a woman from Slate who was campaigning for my marriage to come apart, was going out there saying she hoped that that my husband left me. And we had a guy come to our house. I was in the bath upstairs, and he convinced, our nanny who opened the door that he was a friend. I came downstairs and found him rifling through things in my living room. Okay. I mean, these people will stop at absolutely nothing when they come for you. And you feel powerless. But I mean, so, there were many, really the answer to your question about what was the lowest point is that there were many low points. But at the same time, what I realize is you need to start thinking about, why am I going through this? What is the purpose of this? What am I learning from this? And how am I benefiting from this? Because it's not financially, that's for sure. I'm not benefiting. I wasn't given a big payout or anything like that, because when my contract ended, they wouldn't renew, and I wasn't like one of those people who had a home studio built. It was a different time then. When I was being attacked, people didn't really know about cancel culture. They didn't really understand. It's like you said, we believed that the media was telling us the truth, right? We believed that, Disneyland was a safe place to go. I mean, if someone told you that it's full of pedophiles that work there, you would have been shocked. And now they're like, well, of course, that's where pedophiles go to work, because that's where all the kids are. And you're like, oh, yeah, I see. And then you watch the arrest records piling up, and you're like, it really is true. We just thought that Disney made family movies. You know what I mean? You thought that doctors practiced medicine. You thought that the government might lie, but, they're not going to conspire to remove a political opponent in a presidential election.
What's
and then put
interesting
him
is,
in prison on false charges.
you're a super early victim of cancel culture before the internet, back in the days of fax machines and so on. And it was highly orchestrated. And fast forward, with social media, with the government telling the social media platforms who to censor, who not to censor, it's like it's achieved a level of sophistication that's like kind of scary and happens in really, really fast now,
Yes. Well, I will say Dinesh D'Souza was one of the early victims of cancel culture, and Bernie Carrick, if you remember.
I do.
I mean, former commissioner, right?
He was going to be
from
on
New
the
York.
show. He passed recently. Yeah.
Well, Bernie was a very, very, I loved Bernie very much. He was a very good friend of mine. And I'm still reeling from what happened to Bernie, but he was targeted because he was rising to a position of power, and at the time that he was targeted and sent to prison, nobody understood those things. They thought if you went to prison, if the government charged you with something, you must be guilty. I remember him telling me that they put him in the same cell as, I believe it was Abu Hamid al-Masri, but I might have the name wrong. It was an Islamic terrorist that Bernie had put behind bars, and when he went to jail, they put him in that cell. And when he tried to talk to one of the prison guards about it, the prison guard said to him, "I'm sorry, Commissioner, but this is on the personal orders of Eric Holder himself." So these people are vindictive.
Eric Holder was
okay?
the district attorney. Who's
No, he was Attorney General at the time.
attorney general? Yeah.
He was Obama's Attorney General. They want you to suffer. This is the thing. They don't just want you to get fired. They really want you to suffer. They want you to lose your home, your ability to, feed your children. They want you to come to complete collapse. And if that drives you to suicide, then even better, because they don't have to worry about getting rid of you. What they don't want is for you to come back. And when I was describing to you what they do when they've got you in the dirt and they've got their foot on your throat and they offer you a hand, you can see the difference between the people who take the hand and those who don't.
Yeah.
Right? General Michael Flynn never took the hand because they're still attacking him to this day. General Stanley McChrystal took the hand because he was totally rehabilitated, and nobody says a word about him, and now they love him again.
Wow.
General Allen took the hand because he was, I might have had something to do with that. He did tell me, because when I interviewed him in Afghanistan and he admitted that Pakistan was lying about killing American troops, he then lost the next position he was going to. He was pulled out. That was the end of his military career. But then what happened? Later, he came back as the special envoy to Iraq. He took the hand. I was offered a hand just a couple days after I was put on home leave. A journalist I knew from South Africa, who I hadn't spoken to in a while, called me and invited me to a private dinner with Hillary Clinton.
Oh,
I declined.
yeah.
And look at me. They're still attacking me to this day.
Well, we had another guest on our show, and she was working for ESPN, and she had a little bit of a different strategy.
Sage Steele.
Yes.
I don't know if you know her story.
She sued ESPN during the time that she was still being employed. So she would go to work every day while she was having this big lawsuit, and I'm super happy she won. In hindsight, do you wish that you would have sued CNN and CBS and really just said, you know what, I'm going to fight you guys even harder? Or do you have any regrets? Do you have anything that you would change? Would you have done anything differently?
Well, I did want to take legal action, but everyone tries to talk you out of it, right? Because obviously suing people is very expensive and so on and so on. And then, in the end, when we parted ways, I had to, of course, in order to get my, my severance, I had to agree to give up all my rights. And so, I did it because I couldn't afford not to. That's the truth. I couldn't afford not to. I didn't have the money to do it. But I did want to sue not New York Magazine. There's a reporter who, when he did the hit piece on me, remember that strategic long-term hit piece that came out that got my boss trying to prove to everyone that he didn't favor me in any way, and then got Les Moonves involved. Well, that guy, in order to make that hit piece credible, he had to take what happened to me in Egypt and reduce that to being groped, which is what he said when I was groped. Those are the words. I was groped on the streets of Egypt. And he had to do that because that was a moment that transcended partisan politics. Democrats and Republicans alike, nobody wants to think of, a young woman being gang raped and sodomized and beaten almost to death. And the way that I dealt with that earned people's respect and it earned their trust. And that, I had the editor of the New Yorker wrote to me, an attack on one is an attack on all. Hillary Clinton wrote to me. General David Petraeus wrote to me. President Obama called me on the phone from the White House to tell me how sorry he was about what happened to me. I mean, it was a big deal. And how could they reduce that? And how could they minimize the sympathy for me? The only way they could do it was to lie. So he lied. And I really wanted to sue New York Magazine because of all the things that made me super angry at that point. Any survivor of sexual assault knows that your word is all you have. Yeah. So, that was one of the reasons I spoke out in the first place, because I recognized that this was not going to be my dirty little secret, that I was going to have to carry this in shame, hide it from everybody, figure out how to deal with it on my own, pretend to be normal. That wasn't going to happen. I mean, never. I never even considered that. I don't consider it brave speaking out because not speaking out wasn't even an option for me. And what I learned was that I was able to open the door for many other people to be honest about what happened to them. And sometimes they just told their husband or their wife. Sometimes they just told their mother. But I had tens of thousands of people come to me with those stories. So it was very, very, that was, central to my ability to survive what happened to me, was that it wasn't erased and it wasn't buried. And this guy just flat out lied because he's completely worthless. And I did get an attorney to sue New York Magazine, but I got, what ended up happening was that attorney wrote a complaint that was riddled with things that were not true. And all of them were in my favor. All of them. And they went after CBS and they went after my boss. They went after everybody. And you know what? If I had launched that suit at the height of the Me Too movement, I probably would have won. But I would have completely and utterly sold my soul. And so I had to turn around to that attorney and say, what is this? Don't put my name on this. This is a complete lie. And I believe that was a setup. I think that's another part of the setup, is that you end up with an attorney that is not working for you. Because if she could have won that case, she hated my boss and CBS. She'd won a number of cases against them. So that would have been just another victory for her. And if it had all come apart, I would have been taken down. And and that wouldn't have mattered to them. So then I got another attorney and he just lied and didn't do what he said that he was going to do. And I gave up at that point, because it took too much out of me. And all I can tell you is that at that time, we didn't know about lawfare. People didn't know. For example, when I was investigating the Benghazi story, one of the guys that actually was on that team for the CIA that went with the QRF to the embassy and fought their way in, and then fought their way back to the annex, the subject of 13 Hours, the movie, he agreed to do an interview with me. But he passed me on to his attorney. Well, his attorney had zero interest in helping me. And so I was struggling with this, and I was speaking to another journalist at the time, and he said, have you looked at that attorney's record? And I said, no. What do you mean? And he said, well, he's the go-to guy that you get for taking on the agency, right? And he was the go-to guy. And he said, well, don't you think it's odd that he's never won a case? And this is part of the strategy, what they do. Yes. So the book agent that represents you, what do? They get you a whole chunk of money because they know people need the money, and then they control the narrative. Wow. The movie producer that makes your film, what do? They control the narrative, because look at that movie about Benghazi, 13 Hours. All it did was say these guys were heroes and they fought their way in and they fought their way out. That's it. It didn't tell you why they were there. It didn't tell you who was responsible for the attack. It didn't tell you the Obama administration was lying about Al Qaeda in Libya, lying about Al Qaeda worldwide, lying about the Islamic threat. It didn't tell you anything.
Wow.
What they did is they got the Benghazi movie and book done. They got those guys silenced with NDAs on their way with a nice payout so that they wouldn't come back. And then they made sure that no one else could get a story or a movie made about Benghazi again, because anytime you'd go and pitch that, you know what they say? Oh, that story's been done. That movie's been done.
Wow.
Wow. It's elaborate.
That's how they work.
It's elaborate. I mean, it's crazy, but you know, at the end of this, you know, how do you feel you've come out of this at the end?
You
How
still
where do you
fighting?
feel you're at right now?
Well, I was set free. You know, that's what happened to me. That's how I feel like I've always had the hand of God on me. What I've survived over my lifetime, the places that I've been to, often on my own, not always, and certainly just myself and a cameraman or a producer. You know, small teams, but a lot of stuff that I did solo, and I just know that it was important for me to understand that the media is biased, that the mainstream media was biased, that we all had a similar worldview. It wasn't that, it wasn't that somebody directed you, don't say this, don't say that. It was just that nobody even considered, like, what's a good example? I always give the example of Roe v. Wade. Nobody would have considered reporting on that issue in anything other than, leftist pro-abortion terms. When we covered pro-life movement, it was as these lunatics from the pro-life movement, right? And so you don't realize, because you've come through university, you've come up the same way, you think, everybody was united in their disgust for George Bush and, Cheney and everybody else. And everybody was, when I criticized them, I was elevated. The Washington Post wrote glowing reviews of my work. The New York Times. I was Glamour Woman of the Year. I was one of their women that they honored in their Women of the Year competition. I was in Vogue magazine. I was the future. I was hailed as the future of 60 Minutes. I won the highest award in journalism, the DuPont Silver Baton, from Columbia University. I was, and I was a hard worker, and I worked with my team, and I was very grateful for that recognition. But we always had a thing, you're only as good as your last story. And so I really had no idea that we were inside of this bubble. And when people, particularly soldiers, because I spent 10 years on the battlefield, they would say to me, you guys, what CBS is known as the Communist Broadcasting Service, right? And I'd be like, what? And they thought Dan Rather's a communist. And I'd be like, what?
Yeah.
You guys are crazy. And gradually over time, I started to see the bias creep in. And it's about story selection. What stories do you choose to cover? What stories do you not choose to cover? What do and my boss was not like that. He was a real journalist, and we did great work. But then I think I was being prepared for what was to come, because I'm a living, breathing example that the good is stronger than evil, and the truth is stronger than everything, and God is more powerful than anything else. I am the physical, living, breathing example of that. They've tried to get rid of me so many times. They canceled me from Fox. I never, I'll tell you what happens to you when you get canceled. I got a small contract with a production company in Missoula, Montana, to do a series for Fox Nation, which I did, after my last contract with CBS ended. And I did a year at the border for Sinclair Media in between that. But then I got that contract. Well, all the work I did on Fox News, because I was on Fox News all the time, people will say, oh, the Daily Beast, the right wing gets their darling. There she goes. She should have been at Fox all along because she's such a right winger. And what happened? I never got a contract with Fox. I was working my first salary for that series, Lara Logan Has No Agenda, that I did for Fox Nation, was less than my starting salary as a young CBS News correspondent. And I had to, and I just worked my butt off. I did every, thing that I could do for Fox News, even though I wasn't paid to do it. I did it because I'm a journalist, and that's it's my job, and I feel responsible for that. And I did it because I knew that it would be good for me at Fox. I would be able to build relationships, and I was hoping, that I would have some security again. And I did it to promote my show because I knew that that was important and would benefit me. And then once we were on the fourth season, I think, and we were in the midst of negotiations, they asked me about Anthony Fauci, and I had obviously was familiar with RFK Jr.'s book and what he had written, and I was and had now learned what Fauci did with HIV and about the experiments that he did on, Black and Hispanic orphans, babies, the medical experiments that he did, and all these terrible things. And as an African, I lived through HIV. I stood and watched them, filmed them digging mass graves for all the babies that would die every week, and so these things. And I talked to a lot of doctors, I talked to a lot of people, and they asked me, Fauci says, I am science. And if you criticize me, you're criticizing science. Right. And they asked me about that. And I said, I don't know about that. I said, I talked to a lot of people, doctors and others, and they don't see Fauci as science. They see him more as Dr. Joseph Mengele, doctor of death. Well, they went nuts. Then they said I was anti-Semitic and trivializing the Holocaust, which was the last thing that I was doing. Oh, yeah. And then, and so then I was canceled from Fox, and my agent of 18 years dumped me, and I was canceled again. And then when I was on Newsmax, it's funny because I didn't work for Newsmax, and I was asked, to do many times to do interviews with them. And, this was only about the second or third one I'd ever done. And I made the comment, this is when they were kept, Angelina Jolie and all these people were out there eating insects, trying to promote insects as a real alternative to real food. And I said, these people, they want us to dine on the blood. They want to dine on the blood of children while we eat insects.
Wow.
So Newsmax went to the point of actually putting out a statement saying that I was, now banned and so on. And they canceled me. Wow. And I was like, I don't even work for Newsmax. You can cancel me if you want. Wow. I don't care. So now the truth is, I don't care what they say, and I don't care what they do. I don't waste time. They want you to spend time and energy defending yourself. Wow. And they want to break you slowly. And they have two strategies. It's either attack or they're going to ignore. So if they can get away with ignoring you and pretending that you're irrelevant and you don't matter, they'll do that. But when you really get under their skin, like when I was reporting on Antifa, I'm getting a handwritten death threat mailed to my home address because you're right and they can't bear it. So if you want sort of a roadmap to, who are the people, like when Trump appoints someone and they get attacked, that's a sure sign that they're not owned by the deep state, right? And it's the same thing here. I mean, and I will say there are some great journalists like Cheryl Atkinson, also formerly of CBS, also savaged for her work. She did the Fast and Furious thing. She broke that story. She's been reporting on vaccines forever. In fact, people at CBS used to tell me she was right wing because she was an anti-vaxxer. No. And she wasn't an anti-vaxxer. She just was. There was still mercury in the vaccines at that time. I mean, who thought that was a good idea?
There's still mercury in vaccines now. They just hide it very well. So,
there you go.
You just painted a picture for me that I just got, and I hope that our viewers listening got this as well. It's like the frog in the boiling in the hot water.
Yeah, how to boil a frog slowly.
Yes, where they're taking all these bright, young, beautiful minds.
Yeah.
And they are slowly turning the heat up. They're brainwashing and manipulating. And so these journalists, they're growing up through the ranks and they're thinking, yeah, I'm fighting for truth. Yeah, I'm fighting for what's right. And they're in this box, they're in this bubble, and they can't see that what they're doing is not real journalism. Because there's always this threat they're seeing that, oh, this person that spoke up, they're gone now, and I value my career, and I want to rise through the ranks as well. And oh my God, I wrote this piece, and look at the awards I got for this. Look at the awards I got for that. And so it's almost like subconsciously, I mean, they're in this matrix, but they don't see that they're in this matrix. And you slowly started to peek your head out of the matrix until you were like one day, boom, oh my God. I was living that the whole time and thinking. I was really in alignment because it was how they almost groomed you. They're grooming you guys to be in alignment, to walk in step with one another.
They're grooming all of us.
Yes.
Every college.
Yes.
Every college.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't matter if you're in law or PR or whatever you're in, you're being groomed. And that's what the World Economic Forum and all of that stuff is about. That's how, why we have government by corporations now, right? Like Walmart decides it's going to implement gun controls just because you can't get rid of the Second Amendment through Congress because the American people want it. And the other thing that they do, Dinesh D'Souza made me realize this, there's sort of accepted truths that nobody questions. And that's really dangerous because we're supposed to question everything. So I think actually being attacked and canceled made me a better journalist. I work to a different standard because the truth is that I bet you at least 50 to 60% of what you hear, maybe even 80% on a daily basis, hasn't been vetted or verified by anybody. And they get away with it because number one, because that's often in line with the narrative of the people who are in power, and because nobody cares. So, how do you know? Well, look at, they had information dominance, right? When I was attacked, they had total information dominance. Outside of Rush Limbaugh, and talk radio, there wasn't, you were hard pressed to find anything. And look what they did to that. They said where I worked, I mean, I couldn't have put Rush Limbaugh on an evening news broadcast as a source, or as a person commenting on anything. Even if it was about Rush Limbaugh, I couldn't have done it because people were like, oh, that lunatic, you can't give that right-wing lunatic any credibility. He doesn't have any credibility, right? So they had total information dominance, and now that has been broken, right? And that's a big problem for them. Because they don't control the flow of information anymore. But information has become the battlefield. It's the main battlefield. The problem is with technology, you now have self-censorship at an extreme level. Because if I want to survive in independent media, I got to have a YouTube channel. And to have a YouTube channel, I've got to censor. So I stay within those limits because otherwise I get demonetized and then I can't survive. And so now what's happening, we put our show, my podcast, Going Rogue with Lara Logan, we put that on TikTok just recently, and boom, boom, 2 strikes immediately. And so now what people are doing is they're censoring themselves. They're saving these tech companies from the job of censoring. They're doing it for them. Now that was happening even at 60 Minutes because like you said, you get rewarded. If you lie about Hunter Biden's laptop, you get rewarded. You lie about Russia collusion, you get a Pulitzer. You know what I mean? So we've got a system where you tell the truth, you get punished, and you lie and you get rewarded. You rise through the ranks. Look at these people like Don Lemon making millions and millions and millions of dollars. All these people on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, and they go out there and they lie, and they're not struggling financially. You know what I mean? And they're getting rewarded every step along the way. And so then now what happens? You introduce media, social media and new media, and what do they have? Absolute control. If they want to block you, you're done. You're gone. And they've got all your data, all your followers, all your subscriptions. They've got everything.
Are you on Rumble or any places where you can just, like I said, the Layla show is only on Rumble. I'm not even trying to deal, but
who's going to buy Rumble? Who's bought Rumble? Who has the controlling shares in Rumble today? I mean, technology, these companies change ownership constantly. So you may, for a time, the problem is we are allowed an illusion of freedom and independence on these platforms. Rumble, YouTube, it doesn't matter. If they choose to
Yeah.
cut you off, you're done. And so now we have, like, if you like, you have like a benevolent, authority, a benevolent power. So, okay, Rumble now is controlled by people that give you a voice.
Yeah.
But what if they're bored out?
Yeah,
It's true.
It's true.
Yeah.
So
We don't know where this is
my
going. Cancel
question
culture.
from you is, where do we go from here? What more can we do besides continuing to fight and use our voice because we are so heavily censored? Have you thought about what more can we do?
Well, I think we need to invest in real journalism, because if we don't, like, the knowledge and experience that I have, I don't believe that I survived this long and learned what I have just to take it to the grave, right? I learned from older journalists, more experienced journalists, people who were incredibly talented. I learned the best from the best, and in independent media, who are people learning from?
Yeah.
If you haven't walked into your boss's office, like an excited, little bunny rabbit bouncing up and down because you've got the best story ever, and you lay it out for him, and he just eviscerates you in about 4.5 seconds, rips it to shreds. Have you done this? No, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. And what about this, and that? And you're like, holy crap, I got to do my homework, right? I mean, if you haven't had those kind of experiences, if you're not surrounded, we don't have newsrooms really anymore. I mean, the left has newsrooms. They have resources. They can pay to send people to do firsthand on the ground reporting. Can I go off to North Carolina and see what's going there? Can I go to Syria and see what's happening on the ground there? How am I going to do that? Who's going to pay for it? And by the way, crafted investigative storytelling like I used to do at 60 Minutes. Who's going to pay for
It's
that?
expensive.
It
Yeah.
costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
It takes time to put together. The independent media model is built on churning out content. Churn out more content, churn out more content. Well, daily and immediate content has it's very powerful and important, but it lacks depth.
Yeah.
It's such a dilemma because let's say there was some investment in independent journalism. People aren't going to read print, so you can forget that. Where's it going to appear on YouTube? I don't know. They're going to have to edit them, censor themselves. It's not going to be on the social media platforms. It has to be censored. Blogs, on Medium. It's like, it's
Where does
just,
it
it's
go?
tough. It's tough. Where's
It's
all this
very tough.
going? Yeah.
I don't think we know yet. I think that's probably the truth, right?
Twitter,
I mean,
X.
maybe some smarter people than me know that, but even X has its limitations, and even X, there's people now who are canceled on X, who are censored on X, who don't have a voice, and there's no one to talk to in that situation. There's no human being. And then that's one of my big frustrations, is that if you want to ask someone about something, who do you call?
Yeah.
You can send an email that may or may not be answered.
Yeah. My prediction, they talk about AI controlling us. I believe that AI has already started to control us because I guarantee you, when you got your strikes on TikTok and we got our first strike on YouTube, it was a robot that consumed our
Probably.
content, summarized it, found the offending content, wrote up where the offending content is, time-stamped it, and then gave us the strike, and there was no human intervention at all. The robots are controlling our voice.
Yeah.
It's the first indications of AI controlling us.
Yeah.
Well, and there may be, I think there are actually other indications, like, for example, search results, right? I think search results have been controlled by AI and controlling us for a very long time. In fact, Dr. Robert Epstein, he's a Democrat, but he's an incredible scientific researcher. He did a movie called The Creepy Line, which is about this, showing how they manipulate search results to win elections. And the proper mix is a scientific mix of search results between positive, neutral, and bad that they use in order to be credible. So, and the AI can do that, right? The AI can sort all those articles and make sure that you're getting
boy.
exactly what they want you to see.
Yeah.
So, and now they're talking, the new business models for media are all based on AI. Most of them are based on AI. And I have said to a few people, okay, that's great. Your story was written by AI. How do you know if it's true? How do you know if it's accurate? and who's going to sit and vet that? Because by
Right.
the amount of work and time and money it takes to vet that, you might as well have had a human being on the ground. But what's going to happen over time is we still have the ability to discern because we've lived in the pre-AI time. But what happens when that story has been repeated millions of times because it's in everybody's AI, and the fact that it was never true in the first place is completely lost?
We're doomed. I wish we were ending on a more positive note. Why don't you share with us what you're working on? What are you up to these days?
Well, I have my show Going Rogue with Lara Logan, and I have a great team, small team, but very talented and very committed, and that's really important to me to be able to work with good people. And we're doing long form interviews. I exposed something called satanic accelerationist cults and incels, which is all about these dark networks of people who prey on kids online and they seduce them to commit self-harm. So everything from cutting all the way to the bone to carving their names in their bodies and then
Boy.
committing suicide, and then how this branches into pedophilia and zoophilia, which is animal sex with animals and animal abuse, torture, murder, and then how they recruit mass shooters and mass killers within these networks. So I mean, these are things that I believe are very, very important that need to be exposed. And as long as I'm able to keep doing my job as a journalist, which is really what I was built for, then I have a degree of peace and happiness in my life. And of course, nobody owns me, right? I'm not answerable to anyone as long as I don't sort of build up a dependency. Some people are so dependent on Instagram or YouTube or whatever that they don't feel that they have a choice. When you're stripped of everything, you truly are set free. And I think that people recognize that and they value that. So I don't regret what happened to me at all. I learned a lot, and through my learning, I've been able to share that with people and open a lot of people's eyes. I miss my team. I miss the great work that we did. But look at what has happened to the media. I mean, I would never ever want to be part of something that interviews Bill Gates and doesn't ask him about all the kids in India and Sudan who were sterilized or disabled because of the poison that he was pushing into their bodies, or to put Chris Krebs as the head of CISA on television and after the 2020 election and get him to rubber stamp the theft of an entire election and help to cover it up. I mean, that's disgusting.
Yeah.
That's absolutely disgusting. And to not care. What are you when you don't care that your January 6th defendants are in solitary confinement without even being charged, and you don't think that you as a news broadcast have a responsibility to know the truth?
Yeah.
And put I mean, I just would never have been part of the propaganda. And so I think God spared me from that. I didn't have to make a decision. I didn't have to be noble and give up everything because I got tossed into a wall and obliterated, right?
Yeah.
And then I had to pick up the pieces, and that wasn't a choice. There was no question. I was just going to keep on trucking. But so I just, if you really want to know, the thing is about cancel culture is it's nothing. It's a roadmap to people who are honest and who are in the fight for the right reasons. Don't give them time. Don't give them attention that they don't deserve. Understand it for what it is. Use it to help you have discernment in figuring out what the truth is. But these people truly don't matter to me anymore. I let go my hatred. I let go my anger. They're nothing to me. And they're nothing because we have an urgent mission or struggle on our hands, right? I have to fight for real journalism. I have to fight for that so that people even know what that is.
Yeah.
People don't even know what that is. They think that activism is the same as journalism, and it's not. My boss told me once, you're not a lawyer in a court of law. You don't have to prove a case. You're not an activist, that's fighting for a cause. You are a journalist. And if it's true, don't force it. The facts will come. You will find them. You will find the evidence. You will be able to show the truth, but don't force it. And these were invaluable lessons that need to be passed on. So the one thing that I would urge people to do is don't accept that journalism itself is dead. It only is dead if we let it die. You know, I would also say to other journalists out there, because there are great journalists and great producers. There's a young journalist, Taylor Kramer. He has a site called RGV Truth. You know, these are journalists that are coming up in this new world, and they don't have any guidance. You know, they don't know what are the legal decisions, the ethical decisions that they should be making. So we need to provide that as an industry. We need to build new institutions because our old institutions have failed us. The National Press Club, you know, all of these, Columbia Journalism School, these places have failed journalism. They should be ashamed of themselves. And so who's going to rebuild that? Who's going to fight for that if we don't fight for it? Like if doctors don't fight to save the medical profession, who's going to fight for it?
Yeah.
They're the ones who are most equipped to do that because they know what you're supposed to do when you put medicine and patients first, and money and big pharma second, and politics and your career and the other things that shouldn't factor into it, right?
Yeah.
So I just would urge people to not to accept poor quality as a replacement for all forms of journalism. Sometimes, you know, it's not going to be up to scratch and it's more important to get the truth, but we can't cede that ground of high quality investigative journalism and just give up on it. We have to invest in that, and we have to invest in young reporters.
I think also listening to your story, your journey, and the other stories that we've heard, I love your resilience. They kept smacking you down, punching you, but you're a fighter. And even though, you know, you didn't necessarily fight back in terms of like legally this or that, you fought back by using your voice, by continuing to use your voice and not letting them silence you. And now that you have your own show, of course, yes, there's a little bit of censorship that you might need to do on this or these, but you're still, for the most part, saying everything and anything you want and need to say, which is you stepping back into your power. And like you said a few minutes ago, not caring about what anybody thinks about you anymore.
No.
And I hope that more people hear that message and understand the less we care about what these people say about us, the more of us are going to be able to step into our power.
Great.
And our voices will be heard if there are more of us using them like they should be using. So I wanted to thank you and, you know, just say how amazing you are for not backing down. No matter how many times they tried to silence you and shut you up, you came back stronger and stronger and stronger. So I wanted to thank you for that.
And I think I have maybe a bigger crush on Lara than I did before this.
And I still have a big crush on you too, but not in a gay way.
I probably talk too much, and you two are very kind for listening to me. But I got to tell you, this is what it really comes down to. When you know that there are children that have come across the southern border, for example, that are 2, 3, 4 years old, that have been taken from their families, very often sold, and they're coming here to be raped until they die. And the people telling you that they're better than you and that they care so much about the border, and that's why, you know, they care so much about these kids. That's why Trump and kids in cages and all that stuff, and now why you've got protests. These are the same people. So what you realize is that they don't care at all, but I care. That's the thing that drives me and keeps me going. And I guess I probably am resilient, but I'm resilient because I'm not thinking about those things. I'm focused on the fact that I have a responsibility. I have the ability to let people know what the truth is.
Yeah.
And I trust them. I trust that there will be enough people who will stand up and do the right thing. I really do think so. I think that people want the truth and they gravitate towards the truth. But there are a lot of people who lack moral courage because they're afraid of what they're going to lose. And I'm not sure that I really faced the reality that all those things they're trying to hold on to, those things are gone. Yeah. If we don't have an honest media and we don't have real accountability in this country, and we don't deal with facts and not presented as facts, not opinion dressed up as facts. If we don't fight for these things, we lose it all. We really do. We lose it all. And we owe our children more than that.
Yeah.
We owe their children more than that. You know what I mean?
That's a common theme that many of our guests have said. You have to do it, even if you're going to be unsuccessful in fighting for your own cause. We must do it for the children. We must do it for the future. We must do it so the bullies will say like, well, you know what? There's easier other paths to take.
Well,
So-
if you hold on to your soul, no matter what they took from you, you won.
Sure, absolutely. That's a beautiful way to close the episode. Thank you so much for your time. You're the best. Wish you all the luck in the world. Tell us where they can find your show. All the
You
places.
can find Going Rogue with Lara Logan. You can find it on YouTube for now, on Rumble, on X, on laralogan.com, Spotify, pretty much anywhere.
and shorts on
WhatsApp.
Instagram and I'm sure there's places to
Yes.
follow you as well.
Yes, I
put the
finally
links
got someone
in
who
the notes.
understands Instagram who can help me do that.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Take
Okay.
care.
Okay.
Thank you.